So as we approach the Christmas season, I do think we need to be ready to defend the thing that's celebrated at Christmas.
Bible verses on coffee cups.
Which is, of course, the birth of Jesus.
Ah, yes.
It's an essential truth. It's got to be defended, and I think we owe it to ourselves to be able to explain it, especially as we come across and come upon these high holy holidays of Christianity, where you know this is going to be challenged.
Challenge accepted. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. If you're new to the channel, why not take a second to tap on the subscribe button so that you'll be notified when new science, theology, and news videos come out. Now that Thanksgiving is behind us, it's an acceptable time to be looking ahead to Christmas. And cold case detective J. Warner Wallace took to the podcast airwaves in the spirit of the season.
Today, we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about one of the most challenged aspects of the story of Jesus. I think I'm seeing more and more often that it's the virgin birth of Jesus that gets challenged the most and used as a way to kind of ridicule Christians. So there's a sense that you've got to be a fool to believe in something as ridiculous as the virgin birth.
I wouldn't jump straight to foolishness.
Last night an angel visited me, and now I'm pregnant. Jesus Christ. Oh, you already know about it.
So I'm the stepfather of God's kid? Yeah. So I can't discipline him. I can't go, you've done wrong, because the kid will look at me and say, you're not my real dad. What are you doing, Mary?
But it does seem to be the kind of claim that is outside of ordinary experience, and should require some very compelling corroborating evidence before one accepts it as factual. But Jim here is a cold case detective by day, so I'm sure he'll demand some solid evidence. If a crime suspect or his daughter came to him with a story of a virgin conception, he'd be skeptical, right?
So how do you respond to this? And so for me, it really all came down to the issue of philosophical naturalism. Because even as a non-believer, as an atheist for those 35 years, I believe me, during that time, I was committed as a philosophical naturalist.
For those who may not be familiar with this phrase, philosophical naturalism is the belief, presupposition, or positive assertion that nature is all that exists. It's a hard stance that simply precludes the supernatural. It should be noted that this is different than methodological naturalism, which is a pragmatic, voluntary agreement in the scientific realm to put forth only natural causes within that realm. This has proven to be useful in that, at present, there is no way to discreetly identify or study supernatural causes. Scientists are fully free to hold any supernatural belief they wish, but their scientific research is limited to what happens, not why it happens metaphysically. The success in advancing knowledge by adopting this method is almost undeniable. Law enforcement is another field that utilizes methodological naturalism, so Jim should be aware of it. A detective isn't allowed to propose that a ghost did it. The devil made me do it isn't a legal defense.
Is there, this kind of skepticism about the miraculous, about the supernatural?
Relatively few people hold rigidly to a philosophical naturalism worldview. Most people pragmatically recognize that the natural world does exist and look for natural explanations, all things being equal. However, most people acknowledge the possibility of a supernatural realm, but are waiting for sufficient evidence before they are convinced that it exists. That's where I'm at, open to the possibility, waiting for evidence.
Before we bite on this idea that naturalism can explain everything, I do think almost everyone believes in the miraculous. And it really comes from our understanding of what the miraculous is. Even the friends you have that would probably reject the supernatural and be very hesitant about miraculous events being reasonable, they already accept a great deal of what's miraculous. And if they can at least see it and get their hands around it, they might have a little less difficulty accepting other miracles.
That's a tall order, Jim. I've yet to be presented with anything where a natural explanation seems unlikely, or even implausible, let alone impossible. But I'm open. What have you got?
The number one definition for miracle at dictionary.com is this one. 1. An effect or extraordinary event in the physical world that surpasses all known human or natural powers and is ascribed to a supernatural cause.
I'm not sure I'm on board for the known human or natural powers part. Was lightning actually miraculous before a natural explanation was known? I'd prefer it say all possible human or natural powers. But whatever definition you want, Jim, just sell me.
Well, if that's our definition, I think it is true then that nearly everyone believes in some kind of miracle, one kind of miracle or another. And that includes people who reject the existence of God altogether. Because even as an atheist, I accepted as reasonable the reality of certain supernatural events. What I mean is, I was somebody who embraced Big Bang cosmology, that standard cosmological model.
I'm confused, because Big Bang cosmology is entirely a naturalistic explanation for the observation of our expanding universe.
The Big Bang Theory. And that is still, today, the standard cosmological model, because it best supports the evidence.
It does.
This evidence that proposes that all space, time, and matter, these are still attributes, of the natural universe, that all space, time, and matter had a beginning.
Oh, well, we've found your mistake right off the bat. Big Bang cosmology posits the start of our particular instantiation of space and time. But it most certainly doesn't propose that that was the start of matter or energy. The Big Bang describes the rapid expansion of a singularity where all matter and energy existed before the event. If before time is the appropriate way to describe those conditions. This is so incredibly basic, it's in a sitcom theme song.
Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state.
Were you not aware of the singularity, Jim?
This leap into existence at this point we call a cosmological singularity.
Oh, so you are aware. Do you simply misunderstand, or are you being disingenuous?
Now, the problem I had as a naturalist was that the cause of the universe could not have been spatial, temporal, or material, because these are the attributes of the natural realm that came into existence.
Not at the Big Bang. The material pre-existed that event. Jim is attempting his own version of the cosmological argument here, and it's fine to get philosophical about a state of theoretical nothing that may have predated everything. The entire cosmos, that is, not just our universe. But if you want to do that, you can't attempt to use Big Bang cosmology to try to bolster that position. That's just misrepresenting the science and hoping that your listeners are too lazy to check your claims and learn that you've pulled the wool over their eyes. I was a Christian who discovered that my mentors were being deceptive about things like this. And when authorities lie to you, you stop believing authorities. Present a cosmological argument for God if you find it compelling, but leave the actual cosmology out of your justification. Matter and energy predated the Big Bang.
See the problem? It's ridiculous. It's clearly absurd. So all of us, even as an atheist, I knew this was a problem. How do I explain this?
Could be wrong, but it sounds like you didn't look at this very deeply as an atheist.
I had to accept the existence of a non-spatial, atemporal, immaterial first cause of the universe.
The first cause of our instantiation of space-time was outside of our space-time, but that doesn't imply non-spatial or non-temporal. We can't know if those words are even coherent outside of our context. And immaterial is a non-starter when it comes to our universe. Again, when it comes to the entire cosmos, it seems to me that something did have to be eternal and a brute fact that terminates infinite regress, but that energy is just as plausible a candidate as a disembodied mind. In my case, you have a material cause.
Now, we already talked the definition of a miracle. It's an effect or extraordinary event in the physical world that surpasses all known human or natural powers and is ascribed to a supernatural cause. Okay, well then, of course, the question is going to be, well, what is supernatural?
That is the question, yes.
A very first definition in dictionary.com of supernatural is one of pertaining to or being above or beyond what is natural, unexplainable by natural law or phenomena, abnormal.
As long as unexplainable considers possible future explanations, sure.
Now let's return to our first cause of the universe. That non-spatial, atemporal, immaterial first cause. Don't you think that clearly fits into the definition of supernatural I just gave you?
The cause of the universe was definitely material, and the initial condition of the cosmos was quite plausibly material. So no, it doesn't clearly fit into the definition of supernatural.
It turns out, based on the definitions of supernatural and miracle, atheists actually agree with us on that issue.
Nope.
It is an effect or extraordinary event in the physical world that surpasses all known human or natural powers, and it is going to have to be ascribed to something that is above or beyond what is natural.
Nope.
Wow. It turns out that Christians and atheists actually do agree on the supernatural miracle we call the beginning of the universe.
We really don't. Please try again.
Now, as a skeptic investigating the claims of Christianity, and I was very skeptical about miracles to begin with, anything supernatural, I eventually had to stop and ask myself, okay, Jim, since you accept at least one supernatural, miraculous event.
You may well have been skeptical, but you seem to have adopted a very non-standard view on your path to your current conclusion. I'd encourage you to take another look. Even if you don't, this supernatural conceit isn't necessary among those who consider cosmology beyond your evangelical misconception.
I think you have to be consistent here, don't you? I mean, I happen to hold to a worldview that has at least one unexplainable, miraculous event.
I don't, though.
Well, then I think I have to not reject other worldviews that also have, and really by comparison, much lesser supernatural, unexplained events.
I don't reject a priori. My view will change instantly when I'm presented with sufficient evidence.
So to be consistent, I think all of us, both theists and atheists, have to suspend our presuppositional bias against the supernatural so we can at least look at the claims of Christianity fairly.
I agree. That's why I'm not a philosophical naturalist. Are you willing to suspend your presuppositional biases toward the virgin conception?
That's the first question we have to ask. Is the virgin conception just so unreasonable that it really invalidates everything about Jesus?
Not everything. I'm sure he died even if he was conceived by a human father. An all-powerful God could have done miracles through a regular human just fine. What it would invalidate is any kind of inerrancy or even general reliability of the Gospels.
The first point I typically make with skeptics in this area is that, look, the view you're trying to assess is naturalism and supernaturalism, right? And that's really what we're examining here. Is there any way to actually know that immaterial entities or immaterial truths exist to begin with?
I don't know. Is there?
Now, the second step in this, I think, is that if we're going to examine the truth of naturalism, we cannot begin with a presupposition. It wouldn't be fair. We can't begin with by presupposing that either supernaturalism is true or that supernaturalism could never be true. We can't begin by presupposing either way.
Fair enough. I won't presuppose if you won't.
Third, recognize what we just talked about in the first segment. Everyone accepts something extranatural. Something that, like we talked about, the beginning of all space, time, and matter has to be considered a extranatural, supernatural event.
Except that it doesn't.
And if you think about that, of course, the virgin conception, especially by comparison, is not that big a deal. It certainly is well within the power of a God who could create everything from nothing.
I'm not arguing that it's impossible. Not all possible things happen. I'm asking for the evidence that it happened.
Okay, that being said, I want to kind of clarify that before I go to a couple of things that I think sometimes get challenged about the virgin conception that we can actually respond to quite easily if we are prepared in advance.
Oh, so this isn't going to put forth actual evidence for the virgin birth. Just look to defend it against challenges. It's disappointing, but maybe there are still lessons to be learned here.
There are some ways that people can attack the virgin conception and really kind of go for the throat here as a way to discredit it. You can show that it is historically unviable. It is not historically true. The historicity of the virgin conception is what you cast into doubt.
Alongside the miraculous nature of the claim, the only historical accounts we have of this virgin conception notion are the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. And these are accounts that are radically different and among the most difficult for Christians to harmonize. For example, Luke anchoring the event to Quirinius, and Matthew anchoring the event to Herod, men who didn't serve at the same time. Creative Christians have conjured labored harmonizations, but an unbiased historian should have lowered confidence. In addition, both accounts are clearly wrapped in religious symbolism and explicit pronouncement of prophecy fulfillment. Textual features that weaken a professional historian's confidence in any text, be it the memoirs of Caesar or of Jesus. And speaking of prophecy fulfillment, Jewish scholars and ancient Hebrew linguists are quick to point out that the Old Testament passage the virgin conception is meant to fulfill, Isaiah 7:14, has been incorrectly translated and probably misunderstood by the New Testament authors.
Now listen, I know that people will argue about whether or not the original language supports the idea of a virgin, or if it's just a young girl.
That's right. The Hebrew word Alma is more accurately translated as young girl. Often young girls in that time and place were virgins, but the word doesn't exclude the sexually active. I did a whole video on this with Dr. Josh from Digital Hammurabi called Virgin Mary, Miracle or Misunderstanding.
But I think in the context of what is being said in the entire passage, forget that there's that one verse, there is good reason to describe her in this way as it has been described, as a virgin.
Well, in the original context, it's a short-term prophecy and about an event to happen before a baby graduates to adulthood and moral accountability, and is then fulfilled immediately by an attack from Israel and Syria. This passage was never thought to be long-term Messiah prophecy until
Matthew cites that prophecy of Isaiah when he's describing the birth of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. So, in other words, Matthew saw the virgin conception as an important piece of fulfilled prophecy.
Yeah, Matthew has a few places where he handles the Old Testament sloppily, like imprecisely quoting Micah, and the time he had Jesus awkwardly riding on 2 donkeys because he didn't understand the structure of Hebrew poetry. And this one, inventing a virgin birth to connect imagined dots. Because Matthew said so is terrible justification that sounds very much like someone who has a conclusion first and then goes looking for evidence, rather than allowing the evidence to lead to a conclusion. I thought you were asking everyone to set aside presuppositions, Jim.
One of the ways that people will often do it is they want to attack it by saying that it is really just borrowed from a prior mythology.
I mean, I wouldn't. Though this guy did.
And the Greek demigod Perseus was born when the god Jupiter visited the virgin Danae as a shower of gold and got her with child. The god Buddha was born through an opening in his mother's flank. Catlicus the serpent-skirted caught a little ball of feathers from the sky and hid it in her bosom. And the Aztec god Huitzilopochtli was thus conceived. The virgin Nana took a pomegranate from the tree watered by the blood of the slain Agdestris and laid it in her bosom and gave birth to the god Attis. The virgin daughter of a Mongol king awoke one night and found herself bathed in a great light, which caused her to give birth to Genghis Khan. Krishna was born of the virgin Devaka. Horus was born of the virgin Isis. Mercury was born of the virgin Maya. Romulus was born of the virgin Rhea Silvia. There's no end to the way in which this kind of thing can be fabricated, but those who say that you can just tell by the potency and pungency of the story, by the memorability of it, that there must be something true about it, are simply inviting you to rely not on your thinking faculties or your intellectual capacity at all, but on straight-out credulity and on the repeated manufacture of things that appear to be part of the hard and soft wiring of legend in our mammalian primate history. Apparently, if you want to have a prophet, it's better if his mother is a virgin.
You might say, well, there are claims in the past where gods are having sex with mortal women. They are really described in those scenarios as sex acts, physical sex acts. They're very blatantly described that way. And that is missing entirely from the biblical narrative. That is not what happened to Mary.
I don't know. Here's how it's described by the angel.
The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you.
Sounds like non-consensual sexual activity to me.
Okay. But I'm going to make sure that everyone knows that this happened without my consent.
Deal! No one's going to believe you anyway, so...
Either way, I think the point here is that a half-god, half-human isn't exactly a unique idea in literature, and that the recurring concept crept into those developing legends about Jesus is quite mundane and highly believable. That Christianity may have had its own take on this theme is entirely unsurprising, as we'll hear Jim himself affirm.
I've also heard objections where folks will claim that, hey, the borrowing actually occurs prior to the New Testament. And so the argument here is that somehow paganism influences Judaism first, corrupting these writers of the Old Testament.
While not germane to the point at hand, there are portions of the Old Testament that are very directly influenced by, copied, or even borrowed from the religions of cultures outside of Israel. The first chapter of Genesis is either an adaptation of, or a direct response to, the Babylonian creation epic called the Enuma Elish. Proverbs 22-24 draws on an Egyptian wisdom text called the Instruction of a Many Mope. And Isaiah 19, not too far from the Isaiah 7 passage we're discussing, borrows from the Egyptian Oracle of the Potter, just to name a few. Just some fun facts
Now, I think that theory on its face is rather easy to knock down, because look at it this way. If Isaiah was borrowing the idea of a virgin conception from a pagan source, I think he would have used much more explicit language to describe the mother of God as a virgin. Remember that Matthew is going to refer to Isaiah, right? We know that. And Isaiah is going to use the Hebrew word Alma in describing the mother of the Messiah. Now, that word does mean literally young woman, not virgin.
Exactly. If Isaiah was supposed to be a prophecy about a virgin giving birth, why didn't the author of Isaiah use a Hebrew word that doesn't specifically mean virgin? I'm not sure why the good detective is undermining his own case here, but thank you. Jewish scholars agree. Isaiah 7 was never meant to be a messianic prophecy.
Okay, well, Matthew, we know, is going to interpret Isaiah as describing a virgin.
Exactly. The author of Matthew was wrong about this.
The fact that it's not explicit in that regard, I think, actually works against this theory that
Jesus was the result of a virgin conception?
That somehow paganism was influencing Judaism first.
Oh, both probably.
If the Gospels were written early, and I do think I made a number of claims on this, I wrote a book about it, I mean, you've got it all on the website, you've heard it here on this podcast, I think there's good reason to believe that the Gospels are written early.
I hope to do a more comprehensive video on this in the future, but Detective Wallace is far more aggressive than scholars, even Bible-believing committed Christian scholars, on his idea of early dating of the Gospels. In this article, Detective Wallace puts forth his idea that Mark was written around 45 AD, just 12 years after the death of Jesus. I don't know of any Bible scholar that remotely agrees with this view, but I'll let resurrection-affirming New Testament scholar Mike Licona explain.
The standard dating is Mark about 65 to 70. Jesus is crucified in 30, so that's about 35 to 40 years later. And then Matthew in 80, Luke 85, John 90 to 95.
Wallace's pitching of these crazy early dates seems entirely based on arguments from silence, what the Gospels don't say rather than what they do say, and on the consequences for such dates. This is not how strong cases are made, not in court, and not in scholarship. Until Detective Wallace can convince people with his own beliefs that his fringe view here has merit, it's going to be unlikely to sway a skeptic.
And if that's the case, that means the earliest eyewitnesses would have been available to challenge this false claim about the virgin conception.
Even granting this wishful thinking on dating? Who exactly were the eyewitnesses to a virgin conception? How would that work? What did they witness? Mary not having sex? Or do you mean for some guy to come forward to admit they did have sex with Mary prior to Jesus' birth? Something that would have been a stoning offense? Unlikely. The only potential witness here is Joseph, and according to Catholic tradition, he was already well advanced in age at the time of Jesus' birth, putting him around 100 years old, even with Jim's optimistic timeline. This is a poor argument on all fronts.
That's why I think early dating does a lot for you. If it really is written as early as I think it is, then I think this does a lot toward helping you assess other claims in the early dated Gospels.
I could be wrong, but it sure seems like Jim affirms these early dates only because he thinks the early dates help his case, working backwards from a conclusion.
This virgin conception narrative, for example, I mean, if it's written early, Jesus' own relatives would have been among the first century fact checkers that could have been consulted, would have exposed the narrative as mythology.
That's a whole collection of big assumptions. Even if you buy the whole thing, it's unclear what Mary and Joseph made public and what she kept private, pondering it in her heart, as Luke says. Next, you're assuming that 50 to 80 years after an event, that uneducated, Aramaic-speaking people from Nazareth would have instantly become aware of what a Greek book written hundreds of miles away was saying, and then take up and make the trek to file a complaint. And he's also assuming that there weren't people actively trying to correct the stories. For all we know, there were people lined up outside the temple every day, yelling at the top of their lungs about the evidence against the Jesus myth. We all know that beliefs can survive counterfacts, and that history is preserved by the victors, not the objectors. The detective sure likes his arguments from silence.
I think that the early writing of these texts is helpful for us.
It's helpful, but is it true? If one cares about what's true, one should be most skeptical of that which agrees. Ask your scholarly friends about these dates, Jim.
I think as early ancient men and women began to think and conceive of the notion of God, it was reasonable that they would imagine an incredibly powerful supernatural being, and that somehow this being would emerge into the world in some unexpected supernatural way. Well, that really that shocking? I think that that's something you might expect anyway.
I agree. It's not shocking. It's what I would expect. Jim just perfectly illustrated the reasons to suspect that Christians may well have collectively grown a legend of a god that emerged into the world in some unexpected supernatural way. He's making my case for me.
I also make a claim that Mark's gospel is probably the earliest gospel, but there are lots of things missing in Mark's gospel, it seems. But that being the case, we have to at least admit that the the virgin conception is missing from Mark's gospel. And so what do you do with that? Does that absence of the birth narrative in Mark demonstrate that the entire story is just a fictional creation? I don't think so. And here's a couple of things I would say to that. Number one, I don't think that silence means denial.
I'm glad you recognize that in this context, Jim. But your entire case for early gospel dating is silence on temples falling and disciples dying. Your entire case against pagan influence is a lack of clarity from Isaiah. Your case defending virgin conception is silence from opposition. Which is it, Jim? Is silence a good argument? Or does silence not mean denial? Please be consistent in your methodology.
Yeah, it's true. Mark does not include a birth narrative. There's a lot of stuff that Mark doesn't include. Doesn't mean that he was either unaware or didn't occur. And that's, I think, the biggest point. Do you think he was really unaware of the virgin conception?
Yes. I do think it's very likely that the author of Mark was unaware of the virgin conception, and that this tradition developed later. It's also possible that he was aware of the tradition, but dismissed it as untrue, so wouldn't include it. Again, we're in a position of silence, so all the options are open.
Look, I know from just working with cases that eyewitnesses are...
Wow. It took 52 minutes into the podcast for Jim to first mention that he's a detective. That is impressive restraint.
There's lots of reasons why there's silence sometimes from a witness about something that's important to the case. And I think what you see here in the Gospel of Mark is a true influence, a dramatic influence from Peter. We know this is what Papias says about Mark's Gospel. Papias in the first century says that Mark is Peter's scribe, okay? So, and we know that if you assume this is true, that Papias is telling us the truth about Mark's relationship to Peter.
There are a lot of reasons to think that Papias is not a reliable source for this information. For example, early church father Eusebius dismissed Papias' tales as fantastical and called him a man of low intellect. But that's another topic for another day. Carry on.
Well, then all of a sudden, Mark's gospel makes a lot of sense because it really does seem to follow the outline of Peter's first sermon at Pentecost, because Peter's not going to mention anything about the virgin birth either. He's very pointed.
It's equally possible that this whole virgin birth idea would have been news to Peter. Never heard it before. Silence goes both ways, Jim.
I don't think it should surprise us that the earliest version of the life of Jesus would be the shortest and most focused. I always just try to analogize this to, I did this in a book as well, to crime broadcasts.
You don't say.
The early dating shows us that they're lying early. If you don't believe they're telling us the truth, well, they're lying early.
Or they were mistaken early.
Okay, so I hope that today's podcast will at least give you some ammunition to be able to discuss the reasonable nature of the virgin conception in light of, number one, our thoughts about what is reasonable in terms of miraculous events to begin with, and number two, some of the typical objections related to the virgin conception, and also why it's so important to defend this in the first place.
This was weird. Basically, Jim is saying that if you believe in God, then virgin conception is plausible. Don't worry that the first gospel didn't talk about it. And also don't worry about the fact that this is the kind of detail that lots of religions would fabricate instinctively. That's a far cry from putting forth an argument that would convince someone like me who is open to evidence of the supernatural, if it's compelling enough. But arguments from silence just won't cut it. If you'd like to hear more about how the details of the Matthew and Luke birth narrative conflict with facts from history, and Dr. Josh's analysis on the Hebrew phrasing of the alleged virgin prophecy, tap on the link, and I'll see you over there. Later.